All right, good morning everyone. Today, forms class, we're going to go over the 22B buyer sale of property contingency. This is one of the most complicated forms in the Northwest MLS. A lot of things are involved in this form. Today's goal is to give you a better understanding of the Form 22B and the additional forms involved, so it'll be less complicated the first time you use the form or the next time you use the form. What are some of the reasons why we use Form 22B when writing an offer? Anyone?
They have to sell their home first before they can. It's contingent upon the sale of their home.
Right. It's contingent upon them selling their home, but for what reasons?
They can't afford to buy the other home without the sale of their first home.
Right. So they might have equity in their home, so they have to sell their home for the down payment of the new home. Another reason might be that they can't afford 2 mortgages, so they have to sell their current home before they buy their next home. How many agents here today have been involved in a contingent property sale? So we've got more than about 80%. How many have had those deals fall through? Okay, one out of about the 80%. Yeah, it's very complicated.
And it's not going to.
Why is it complicated? Number one, there's 3 parties involved. And with those 3 parties, there's 4 sides. So basically we have 2 buyers and 2 sellers. So we have the property that's listed, the buyer who wants to buy that property. That buyer becomes a seller as well, and they need a buyer to buy that property. So we have all these moving parts that actually becomes a domino effect. So if that first buyer down the line, they can't buy the home that's contingent, sell, everything falls apart. And then you have 3 parties who are going to have to start all over. Some of the additional forms that are involved with a 22B, write these down. Form 44, Form 46, Form 90K, Form 90L.
90 what?
90K,
Yep, and then
Sorry.
90L,
90.
and Form 39. So all of these forms are involved in some way, shape, or form to the 22B. So going into the form, if you have that in front of you, line 1. So contingent on sale of buyer's property. This agreement is contingent on buyer selling buyer's property at, fill in the address, city, state, on or before, how many days? Default is 45 days, which we can consider an average amount of time. If we're in a fast-paced market, maybe we want to lower that to 30 days. If we're in a slower market, maybe extend that to 60 days, because it might take a little bit longer for the buyer to sell their home. The contingency period, buyers shall list buyer's property for sale on a multiple listing service in the area serving the property with a licensed real estate firm within 5 days of mutual acceptance. Okay. 2 things I want you to either underline or highlight. Buyer shall list buyer's property, highlight or underline that, and then highlight or underline 5 days after mutual acceptance. Those are 2 very important things to remember when using the Form 22B. If buyer fails to do so, this contingency shall be deemed waived and paragraph 6D shall apply. If you jump over to page 2 of the Form 22B, section 6D, waiver by buyer. I'm going to jump down to the 2nd sentence in that. By waiving this contingency, buyer also waives all other conditions in this agreement, including financing or any other contingency. So any other contingency could include inspection. So just be aware that if buyer waives, they're waiving everything else, all other contingency. If buyer waives this contingency, whether after failure of buyer's property to close or otherwise, the property shall close 30 days after buyer's waiver. So go through and either highlight or underline that second sentence in section D. I'm going to jump back over to the first page, section 1. If buyer has not sold buyer's property or given notice waiving this contingency by the end of contingency period, then this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. For the purposes of this addendum, the terms sell and selling and sold shall mean that buyer has entered into a valid and enforceable agreement for the purchase and sale of buyer's property. Section 2. When seller's consent is required on sale of buyer's property, buyer must obtain seller's written consent before buyer accepts any offer for the sale of buyer's property that A, is contingent on the sale closing of that second buyer's property, and or B, has a closing date less than 30 or more than 60 days from the date of mutual acceptance of the offer on buyer's property. So if any of those two items come up, you need seller's consent. And to get seller's consent, you will want to use Form 90L. So please write that down to the side of paragraph 2, 90L.
Russ, why would it, I can see why over 60 days would be an issue for a seller, but if they wanted to close quickly.
So why do you have to give, the question was, why do you have to give a notice over 60 days or less than 30? The question is because the seller has to be prepared. If they're going to close in 10 days, is that enough time for the seller to be prepared to move out? So you would need the seller's consent to do that, and that would be on Form 90L. If buyer accepts any such offer without seller's prior written consent, seller shall have 3 days. Please underline or highlight, seller shall have 3 days.
Where is it?
Paragraph 2, second paragraph.
Yes,
Number 2,
we're on section
paragraph.
2, second paragraph. Seller shall have 3 days to terminate this agreement from buyer's notice that the contingency is satisfied, which notice shall include a complete copy of the purchase and sale agreement for the buyer seller property. And upon seller's termination, buyer shall be in default and seller shall be entitled to remedies as provided for in the agreement. If seller does not timely terminate, the agreement shall not be effective. So if the buyer accepts an offer that's less than 30 days or more than 60 days, if they don't get the consent from the seller, they will be in default. Basically what the seller can do, they can give notice to terminate. In effect, what will happen is, when that happens, what's going to happen is the buyer is going to have basically 30 days to close without any contingencies. Okay, on a typical sale of contingent property, what is the average earnest money, would you say? Oh, I'm sorry, let me take that back. So the average price of a contingent home in King County right now is about $800,000. So on a purchase price of $800,000, what do you believe is the average earnest money?
50,000.
15.
50.
I think probably have plenty that are 10.
10%?
Okay, 10%.
Or
Okay.
not 10%.
Earnest?
Or
10,000.
10,000.
10,000.
So there is a lot of money involved that could be at risk. But-
Well, and they can get sued for damages, too.
And that's always a potential as well. So make sure when you're, for a listing agent, when you're accepting a contingent offer, make sure you get a copy of the buyer's purchase and sale agreement on their contingent home. Read that and make sure you read when that closing date is. And make sure it's between the 30 and 60 days. And make sure they get your consent. If not, you have the right to terminate the agreement. Loan application. If this agreement is contingent on buyers obtaining financing pursuant to Form 22A, financing addendum, buyer shall make a written application for the loan and pay the application fee if required for the subject property. I'm gonna have you highlight this sentence, within days, blank days, 5 days, if not filled in, that's the default, after mutual acceptance of this agreement. So highlight that right there, within 5 days, if not filled in, after acceptance of this agreement. The other option is, or within 5 days after buyer satisfies the contingency in this addendum from mutual acceptance, if neither box is checked. So what I'm gonna recommend is, if you're the listing agent, always have that box checked within 5 days after mutual acceptance. You want the buyer to apply for the loan. You want to make sure they're going to be able to get financed instead of waiting until after the satisfaction of the contingency or when they receive an offer. Because anything can happen at that time, during that time. Because if they wait, excuse me, if the buyer waits until they receive an offer, they might find out they cannot get financed. So you want to make sure they apply for a loan 5 days after mutual acceptance. That's the best case scenario. If buyer is not required to apply for loans until after satisfaction of this contingency, the timelines in Form 22A shall not begin until that time. This paragraph 3 supersedes the requirement for buyer's loan application in Form 22A. Going down to section 4, property remains on market. Seller may keep the property on the market in the contingent status until seller has received notice that buyer has satisfied or waived this contingency. If prior to that time, seller accepts another offer, seller shall give notice to buyer and give buyer blank days, 5 days if not filled in. So highlight that there. Seller shall give notice to buyer and shall give buyer blank days or 5 days if not filled in. Highlight that area just as a reference. Or by the expiration of the contingency in paragraph 1, whichever is earlier, which is considered the bump period, to waive or satisfy this contingency. If buyer does not timely waive or satisfy this contingency, this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. Seller's notice shall be on the bump notice, Form 44, or similar form, and buyer's reply shall be on bump reply, Form 46, or similar form. And I will come back to these two forms at the end. One thing for a listing agent, I recommend once you accept a contingent offer, do not allow that buyer's agent to put up a sold sign. Keep marketing that property, because if that buyer, if they never get an offer on their property, it's lost time. Make sure you continue to market that property, hold open houses, get an initial buyer in who might come in with an offer that's not contingent, and maybe they can close in 20 days. Take the sure thing. So continue to market the property after you've accepted a contingent offer. Contingency satisfied. Buyer shall give notice to seller within 2 days. Please highlight or underline 2 days of entering into an agreement to sell buyer's property. The contingency is satisfied. Next sentence, 2 sentences here, I want you to highlight or underline. Buyer's notice shall include a complete copy of the purchase and sale agreement for the buyer's sale of property. The sale of the property shall close 3 days after the closing of the sale of buyer's property. Buyer's notice shall be on the contingency property notice, Form 22K. So highlight or underline all that section. Buyer needs to, along with the Form 90K, attach a copy of the purchase and sale. If the buyer does not, the buyer will be in default. So buyer may not extend the closing date for the date of the sale of buyer's property without seller's consent. Next page, section 6. Notice to seller. Okay, buyer shall give notice to seller within 2 days, highlight or underline 2 days, of learning that the sale of buyer's property has failed. If buyer does not give such timely notice, then buyer shall be in default. Please highlight or underline buyer shall be in default. Such notice must be given regardless of whether buyer chooses to proceed with this agreement. Okay. Buyer's notice, that will be on Form 90K. So in the side of Section A, please write 90K. Going down to B, contingency survives. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close through no fault of buyer before expiration of the contingency period in paragraph 1, then this contingency shall be reinstated until the contingency period has expired. So if the buyer's property receives an offer and that falls through, you have to give notice to the seller, Form 90K, and if there's still time left, as in stated on Section 1, let's say you have 5 days after mutual acceptance to write that in, buyer shall list property on multiple listing service for X amount of days. So let's say on day 30, buyer's offer falls through, there's 15 days remaining. Give notice that buyer sale failed, but you still haven't, but it's reinstated and you have an additional 15 days to receive an offer to sell your property. Agreement terminates. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close through no fault of buyer after expiration of the contingency period, so that'd be after the 45 days, then this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Going back to Section D, waiver by buyer. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close through no fault of buyer after expiration of the contingency period, buyer shall have the option of waiving the contingency and proceeding with the agreement. By waiving this contingency, buyer also waives all other contingencies. Be aware of that. In this agreement, including financing or any other contingency. If buyer waives this contingency, whether after failure of buyer's property to close or otherwise, the sale of the property shall close 30 days after buyer's waiver. So if buyer waives this contingency, closing date is in 30 days. Line 7, going back to Section E, waiver by buyer, new construction. If at the time of buyer's waiver, a certificate of occupancy or its equivalent for the property has not been issued by the applicable government authority, then buyer shall close within X amount of days, 5 if not filled in, of notice from seller that the certificate of occupancy or equivalent has been issued, or within 30 days of waiver, whichever is later. Closing date. The closing date set forth in this addendum shall supersede the closing date set forth in this agreement on Form 21. So on your original purchase and sale, when you have a closing date, you can do a couple things. Leave it blank, or what I write in, see Form 22B, because that's going to dictate when your closing date is. Question?
Going back to D, now, if the buyer property fails to go through no fault of buyer after expiration of contingency, does the seller have the right to terminate the agreement?
After a waiver?
Okay, yeah, it says waiver by buyer. If the buyer waives, he's past the contingency date, and he waives all the contingencies, right? So does the seller at that point have the right to terminate?
Okay, so the question is, once the buyer waives the contingency, does the seller have the right to go back and terminate? No. So basically, once the buyer waives, we're going to close within 30 days. If we don't close within 30 days, the buyer at that point is in default. Okay, bump notices. If you do it. Okay, if you have Form 44 in front of you, we're going to talk about bump notices. So on the bump notice, so if the seller receives another offer, he can bump the first buyer. Okay, on this form, seller gives notice that seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property as permitted by the buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B. Unless buyer gives notice before expiration of the bump period that buyer has satisfied or waived the contingency, this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Buyer should use the bump response form 46 to respond to this notice. So seller, another offer comes in. Seller can accept that. And what he does, he sends a bump notice, giving the buyer the opportunity to waive the contingency. Or within those 5 days for the response, or whatever the response time is, maybe that buyer can get an offer in and satisfy the contingency. That's a possibility as well. But if not, then the buyer will either have to waive the contingency or it's going to be terminated and you will be bumped. Okay, and at that portion, if you are bumped, the earnest money will come back to the buyer. And Form 46 is the buyer's response to Form 44, bump response. In response to notice that seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property, the bump notice, buyer gives notice as follows. First box, buyer's property sold, contingency satisfied. Buyer has accepted an offer to sell buyer's property that is not contingent on the sale or closing of another property, and that will close no less than 30 days and no more than 60 days from the date buyer accepted the offer or otherwise consented to by seller. For this notice to be effective, buyer shall attach a copy of the complete purchase and sale agreement for the sale of buyer's property. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close, buyer will give notice to seller within 2 days as required by the buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B. Second box. Buyer's property not sold, contingency waived. Buyer has not accepted an offer to sell buyer's property. However, buyer waives the contingency in buyer's sale of property contingency addendum. Buyer understands that by waiving this contingency, buyer waives all other contingencies in the agreement, including inspection, financing, etc. Third box, buyer's property not sold, agreement terminated. Buyer has not accepted an offer to sell buyer's property. The agreement is terminated, and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Any questions on any of those two forms?
A comment more than anything, since we're writing forms in the paragraphs, on the bump notice, the offer that's been accepted, the second one needs to include that Form 39 that I know you're gonna go over.
Yes.
But you might wanna write 39 in the margin next to that paragraph as well.
Okay,
Just so you know that you have the right forms
So-
all put together.
correct. So this is for the seller. So when the seller receives a second offer from a second buyer, that seller is going to send over to that buyer a Form 39, second buyer's addendum. So be familiar with that if you are a listing agent.
I think it should be part of the offer that you received from the second buyer.
Correct.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah, you include that
gotcha.
with the offer from the second buyer.
Gotcha.
That is correct. So be familiar with that form if you are a listing agent and you do receive a second offer from the second buyer. Any questions on the 22B? Any questions from the Burien office?
I think we're doing okay, thank you.
Okay. One thing I'm going to add, which is completely separate from the 22B. This is Form 22Q, and that's not part of your packet. So Form 22Q,
Russ, give me a second to bring it up. 1 second. Got it.
okay. 22Q. So if you're working with a buyer, and the buyer has an offer on his home, and you're writing an offer to purchase another home, instead of using the 22B, you're going to include the 22Q. Okay, 22Q is completely separate from the 22B. Okay, so 22Q is buyer's pending sale of property contingency addendum. So basically it states, pending sale of buyer's property, this agreement is contingent on the closing of the sale of buyer's property located at address pursuant to the purchase sale agreement dated. The complete purchase and sale agreement for the pending sale must be attached to this agreement. The term pending sale includes property that may be subject to an inspection, feasibility, or other contingency. So make sure that the only time you're using this is if, when you're the buyer's agent, is if you already have, your buyer already has an offer on their property. If they do not, you're going to use the 22B. Okay, so once you've used the 22B, do not use the Form 22Q at all. And with this form, there is a response, buyer's pending sale contingency notice. That would be the 90U. Just use that as a reference to go with the 22Q. Complicated? Not complicated? Yes.
Just to remember, that's all.
Yeah. So with those things that I had you highlight, just use those as a reference when you go back. And these are the time frames. These are the dates I need to know. You know, because if you're ever in default, there's a lot of earnest money on the line, and it's easy if you haven't gone over this at all to miss a time frame or miss a notice that you need to include. Okay.
Well, and notice too that in a lot of these paragraphs, they've identified that the earnest money is returned to the buyer. At no time do they say anything like that it goes to the seller when they use the term default, because they are subject to be sued for damages. And it's not just about the earnest money. It could be about a lot more than that.
Correct. If you didn't hear that in Burien, one thing that Karen mentioned is that they don't always state that the earnest money will go back to buyer, because a lot of times this could become a legal issue. If something was misrepresented, if there was misrepresentation, or if there was a failure to disclose something. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So there could be more than just earnest money at risk. Okay, a lot of moving parts with the 22B. If you haven't done one at all, go over these forms ahead of time. Check with your sales manager, Nalani in the Burien office, myself at the West Yale office, or talk to the branch manager, Tay. Okay, we will help guide you through this so it's less complicated. Even if you've done this a couple times, a lot of times the 22B is few and far between. I know experienced agents who haven't done the 22B in years. Okay, now is a good time to get familiar with it, because we are in a market that's kind of mixed. Some things are moving slower, which is good for buyers. It's giving them an opportunity to write an offer contingent on the sale of their property.
Russ, like you just said there, if you haven't used the form in a while, you'll notice at the top left-hand corner that the revision date was 2/17. So it was a little while ago, but not all that long ago, and contingencies kind of were not being utilized too much anywhere around 2/17. So really, a lot of folks, the last time that they did a contingent offer may have been using a form before this latest revision. So again, a good reason to review or to practice.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that, and I think everyone heard that, especially on the Burien side. Any questions from the Burien office?
We do, can you go to Form 39, please? She's looking at the form to find where her question was.
This form, even if the listing is not contingent, but can you use this as a backup offer?
Yes.
Can you use this form in conjunction with a backup offer situation?
Outside of a contingency?
Yes, that's the question, outside of contingency.
Where would you benefit by that? I'm just trying to figure out. Well, if you come in with an offer and waive everything and first deny, could you use this to bump first offer? Oh, that's kind of different, like they have all kind of a regular first offer. Okay. Like in a regular situation, then.
We're good.
Okay, yeah, so Form 39 you would use in conjunction with Form 22Q.
Yeah.
I've got a question, Russ. Could you just, real quick, just articulate, if I have a listing and I have somebody who is presenting an offer to me, or to my seller, that's contingent on them selling their house, what would I, as the listing agent, want to do at that point? There's probably a set of things that I would want to vet before accepting a contingent offer.
Great question. So if you are the listing agent and you have someone wanting to write a contingent offer, one of the things I would recommend is getting the address of that property, doing your own little CMA to see what that price should sell for. Ask the other agent, what do they plan on listing that home for? If they're listing it higher than what you think it will sell for, that home's just gonna sit. That means your listing's gonna sit for a while, because when you go contingent, you're getting less people coming through your home. It's not showing up as active. Agents and buyers have to do a search for contingent homes. It's not gonna come up as active. So make sure when you accept a contingent offer, the home that they're gonna list and sell is priced right. If not, you're basically wasting your time. Because after 45 days, when the contingency expires, you're going back on the market as active. It might take another 30 days, 60 days to sell your home thereafter. So listing agents, make sure you do find out from the buyer's agent where that home's located and what they're gonna list that home for. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. It definitely, the original listing agent, the one that is receiving the contingent offer, really has a heightened sense of responsibility, because that person really needs to do a good job of vetting whether or not the contingent property has a realistic opportunity to sell. Is it really gonna be there? And in fact, sometimes it can be a little bit, it can feel a little uncomfortable, but I would say that listing agent and potentially the seller themselves, it would be reasonable for them to request to see the house that is being sold contingent, so that they can do a full market analysis of their own to determine if they think that list price is gonna be reasonable, because it can really harm the seller to agree to a contingent offer on a property that was grossly overpriced on the other side.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to ask is, if you continue to market the property after you've accepted a contingent offer, what status would you put the listing on the MLS as?
Contingent.
It's contingent,
Yes.
yes. So it's on the MLS as contingent, but continue to market it. Make sure no sold sign goes up from the buyer's agent.
And buyer's agents should continue to show contingent properties and search for those and go to the open houses and that, because that's an opportunity for them to potentially get a unit or a home that somebody else isn't even on their radar, because they don't search on contingent.
I think that happens a lot.
That happens a lot.
And going back to the listing agent doing their due diligence when an offer does come in, don't be afraid, if they're gonna list their home at a certain price, if you feel that's above the market, don't be afraid to negotiate and tell them to bring that listing price down. And then you'll accept their offer if they list it at X amount, which you feel is more reasonable for the market. So don't be afraid to negotiate down.
So Russ, what if you have an open house and somebody isn't even really looking at buying or selling their house, but they do come in, they decide they really like this house, they want to make an offer, where it's like line 10 where they have to put it on within 5 days of mutual, can you cross that out and give them like 10 or 15 days? Like somebody might not, like Form 22B, line 10, says they have to put their home on the market within 5 days of mutual. Can you change that to like 10 or 15 days?
So if you were to accept a contingent offer, Basically, you're taking your home off the market, it's going contingent, but you're giving them an extra 15 days.
To get theirs ready. I'm just saying, some people, like I had a gal come into my open house and she was nowhere ready. I mean, if she decided she wanted to make an offer and say, we can't have it on in 5 days, but we can probably get it on in a couple of weeks.
If I was the listing agent, I would say, get your home prepared and ready, and at that point, we'll accept your offer.
Okay.
I personally.
Or say no.
Yeah, or say no. I would not accept that offer early, knowing that it's gonna take them 15 days to get their home on the market.
Okay.
It really does them no good to make a contingent offer in that case, because ultimately they can still get bumped any time in those 2 weeks that they don't even have the property on the market. So really, it doesn't even really help the buyer feel that they're necessarily tied to the property, because they could ultimately just get bumped before they ever even have their house up for sale. So it's the same difference if they just wait until their property's ready.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is there ever, I mean, is it common for the listing agent to check out the contingent property?
Is it common?
Yeah. mean,
I
do you ever-
wouldn't say it's common, but I would recommend that a listing agent do that.
Okay.
I think it's more common that listing agents are lazy, right? And they get an offer and they're like, oh, okay, well, I can get it sold. So I think it's more common that they don't, but I think any agent that really is worth their weight would be doing that. I mean, you'd be doing your seller a huge disservice if you don't.
And if the home is in a desirable area and is in a market that will likely, the days on market will be short, it's desirable. If they're not in a desirable area, that could also weigh the decision of whether they accept that contingency or not.
Correct. Yeah, don't be afraid as a listing agent not to accept a contingent offer.
Yeah.
If the contingent property is priced well and is in a good area, a contingent offer could theoretically be better than a non-contingent offer depending on the rest of the terms, primarily the dollars. But there are often times that a contingent property will sell super fast, and you know if it's a craftsman priced right in West Seattle, it's going to sell in 2 seconds. Well, that may be a pretty sure bet.
Yes. All right, any other questions from Burien?
No, I think we're following along just fine.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I have for today. As I mentioned, this is a complicated form, lots of parts involved. Please reach out to your sales manager or your branch manager for further guidance and to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Like,